The front door of the suburban house flew open with a violent crash that echoed down the quiet neighborhood street. A heavy leather suitcase tumbled down the concrete steps, bursting open on the damp lawn and scattering folded clothes across the cold autumn grass. Standing on the porch was Richard Vance, his face hardened into a mask of pure resentment as he pointed a trembling finger toward the dark pavement. He looked straight into the eyes of his 22-year-old daughter, Hannah, and uttered 5 words that would forever divide her life into before and after: "You're no longer my daughter." Hannah stood frozen on the driveway, her breath misting in the night air as the weight of those words crushed the wind from her lungs. Across the street, porch lights flicked on and neighbors stood behind sheer curtains, staring out at the spectacle without offering a single gesture of help. Even her Aunt Claire, who had come over for Sunday dinner just an hour earlier, stood on the porch behind Richard and turned her face away, refusing to meet Hannah's pleading gaze. Nobody stepped forward to defend her, and as the heavy wooden door slammed shut, the metallic click of the deadbolt sounded like the ceiling of a tomb. How would you feel if the person who was supposed to protect you above all others looked at you like you were a stranger and threw you out into the freezing night? Have you ever experienced a moment where every certainty in your life vanished in a single second? 12 hours later, that same man stood outside a $30 million Malibu mansion, begging security to let him inside. He had no idea the owner was the daughter he had thrown away, and what he was about to discover would destroy every lie he'd spent 20 years protecting. Because the mansion wasn't the inheritance. It was the trap. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. As Hannah sat shivering in the driver's seat of her rusted sedan outside a 24-hour gas station that morning, 6 desperate questions pounded inside her mind with relentless intensity. Why did her father suddenly decide to throw her out on a cold October night with no warning and no money? Why did her late grandfather, Arthur Vance, explicitly predict that this heartbreaking estrangement would happen down to the exact year? Why was a sprawling $30 million estate sitting behind wrought iron gates on the Pacific coastline, legally waiting under her name? What profound, unspoken secret did her mother, Evelyn, leave behind before her sudden death nearly 12 years ago? Why had a team of high-powered corporate attorneys been quietly monitoring Hannah's movements from the shadows since her 18th birthday without ever introducing themselves? And perhaps most baffling of all, what devastating truth was hidden inside the final handwritten letter her grandfather had placed inside a bank vault shortly before his passing? She believed she'd lost everything. She had no idea someone had been planning this moment for 20 years. When the lead attorney finally approached her car window under the flickering streetlights, his voice was calm and measured. "Your grandfather told us this exact day would come. To truly understand how a father could cast his only child out into the street, we have to go back 12 years before that cold night on the lawn, before she passed away." Back then, the Vance household was filled with the warm scent of lavender tea, the vibrant sound of classical piano melodies drifting through the hallways, and the gentle, comforting laughter of Hannah's mother, Evelyn. Evelyn was the emotional anchor of the family, a woman whose kindness illuminated every room she entered and who always reminded young Hannah that a family's strength lay in honesty and unconditional love. But when a sudden respiratory illness claimed Evelyn's life within just 2 months, the soul of the suburban home evaporated overnight, leaving behind a cold, hollow shell. Almost immediately after the funeral, Richard's demeanor underwent a chilling transformation that confused and terrified his 10-year-old daughter. He stopped looking Hannah in the eye during dinner, stopped asking about her school projects, and retreated behind the locked door of his ground-floor home office for hours on end. Can you imagine being 10 years old, grieving the loss of your mother, and suddenly realizing that your surviving parent is treating you like an unwelcome ghost in your own home? During those long, lonely years of middle school and high school, only one person stood between Hannah and total isolation: her paternal grandfather, Arthur Vance. Arthur was a self-made industrialist who had built a quiet fortune over 5 decades, yet he wore simple tweed jackets and drove an older domestic sedan because he valued humility over showmanship. While Richard routinely forgot Hannah's birthdays, Arthur would arrive on the exact morning with a warm bakery box containing a single chocolate cupcake and a handwritten card reminding her of her inner strength. When Hannah walked across the stage at her high school graduation, she looked out at the auditorium seats and saw no sign of her father, who had claimed he was too busy with work meetings to attend. But sitting in the very back row, his posture tall despite his advancing age, was grandfather Arthur, clapping louder and prouder than anyone else in the crowded building. Yet amidst his unwavering kindness, there was always an underlying current of watchfulness about Arthur that young Hannah couldn't fully comprehend at the time. Why did she frequently spot her grandfather's car parked across the street from their house late on rainy evenings, with Arthur staring intently at Richard's office window while jotting down detailed notes on a yellow legal pad? The answer to Arthur's mysterious vigilance was rooted in a pivotal moment that occurred exactly 3 weeks before she passed away in the sterile stillness of the hospital ICU. Arthur had come to visit his daughter-in-law on a quiet Tuesday afternoon when the nursing staff had temporarily cleared the visitors' wing and Richard was away from the hospital. Evelyn, weak for medication and struggling for breath under the hum of the oxygen monitors, motioned weakly for her father-in-law to lean his ear close to her lips. She whispered a series of urgent, trembling words that no medical monitor or recording device ever captured, her eyes wide with a mixture of profound maternal terror and desperate hope. Tears rolled steadily down Evelyn's pale cheeks and soaked into the crisp hospital pillowcase as she reached out with her frail hand to grip Arthur's aged, calloused fingers. Arthur did not offer platitudes or easy reassurances. Instead, his jaw tightened with quiet determination. He squeezed her hand gently, and he nodded his head to seal a sacred promise made between two parents who understood what was at stake. When Arthur walked out of that hospital room into the bright fluorescent corridor, he carried a heavy burden that he would protect with every fiber of his being for the rest of his life. 12 hours after the suitcase landed on the damp lawn, that same promise finally materialized as 2 polished black town cars pulled into the gas station parking lot right beside Hannah's car. 3 men and 1 woman dressed in sharp, tailored charcoal suits stepped out onto the oil-stained concrete, looking entirely out of place against the backdrop of the rundown convenience store. The senior partner, a man in his 60s with silver hair named Thomas Miller, approached Hannah's open driver's side window and tipped his head with deep professional respect. "Miss Vance," he said in a voice that carried authority and warmth, "my name is Thomas Miller, and I represent the estate of your late grandfather, Arthur Vance. We have been monitoring your residence continuously for the past 4 years, under strict instructions to intervene immediately the exact moment your father severed his residency obligations toward you." Hannah was so utterly exhausted and overwhelmed that she could barely process his words, gripping the steering wheel until her knuckles turned white as the attorneys waited patiently in the morning drizzle. Why had her grandfather instructed legal counsel to treat her father like a ticking time bomb, and what specific trigger had activated this elaborate security net on this exact October morning? Within an hour, Hannah found herself sitting in the quiet, plush leather interior of the town car, watching the suburban neighborhood fade away as they entered the winding coastal highway toward Malibu. The contrast between the cold, damp car where she had spent the night crying and the silent, climate-controlled sanctuary of the vehicle felt entirely surreal to her exhausted senses. Soon, the car turned off the main highway and approached a massive stone wall topped with discreet security cameras and a towering set of black wrought iron gates that gleamed in the coastal sunshine. The driver pressed a button on the overhead console, the gates swung open with a heavy, smooth mechanical whir, and the vehicle climbed a manicured driveway lined with ancient olive trees and blooming white hydrangeas. At the summit of the coastal bluff sat a breathtaking 3-story modern estate built of poured concrete, floor-to-ceiling glass, and warm cedar wood, overlooking the endless blue expanse of the Pacific Ocean. As Hannah stepped out of the car onto the limestone courtyard, her eyes drifted toward a polished brass plaque mounted discreetly beside the double-glass entry doors, the Hannah Vance estate. Despite Hannah's barrage of questions about who paid for the property and how long it had been standing on the cliffs, Thomas Miller politely declined to offer verbal explanations in the driveway. Instead, he led her through the soaring glass foyer, where the scent of cedar and sea salt hung in the air, and directed her toward a formal mahogany table in the center of the room. On the tabletop lay a single cream-colored envelope sealed with dark red wax, bearing her first name written in the distinctive, flowing cursive script that she instantly recognized as her late grandfather's handwriting. "Miss Vance," Miller explained as he stepped back to give her privacy, "your grandfather explicitly instructed us that before we show you any financial ledgers or property deeds, you must open and read this letter alone." Hannah's hands trembled violently as she broke the brittle red wax, unfolded the heavy linen paper, and recognized the opening lines that had been penned exactly 6 months before Arthur passed away. "If your father ever throws you away. My worst fear has come true. If you're still watching, type 'I'm still here' in the comments, and tell us what city or state you're watching from. Let's see how far this story has reached." 3 days after Hannah moved into the estate, the inevitable disruption occurred when local property tax registries automatically updated across county databases, alerting someone inside Richard's professional network. Early on Wednesday afternoon, the peaceful roar of the ocean waves was shattered by the sound of a luxury SUV skidding to a halt at the outer security gate at the bottom of the bluff. Through the high-definition intercom system, Richard's voice crackled with fury as he demanded immediate access, claiming that his daughter had committed identity theft and forged financial documents to acquire the property. When the private security guards refused to lift the gate without authorization, Richard began kicking the iron bars and threatening to bring the federal authorities to lock up everyone on the premises. Hannah stood inside the second-floor master suite, watching the security monitor with her heart hammering against her ribs, wondering if the nightmare of her father's rage would ever truly leave her alone. How would you react if the parent who disowned you suddenly appeared at your doorstep days later, not to apologize for their cruelty, but to accuse you of being a criminal? Thomas Miller instructed the security guards to permit Richard entry onto the property, knowing that the legal architecture Arthur had constructed over 2 decades was entirely impenetrable to intimidation tactics. When Richard stormed through the front glass doors into the marble foyer, his face flushed red with anger, he immediately pointed a finger at Hannah and demanded to know where she stole the money. Without raising his voice or displaying the slightest trace of anxiety, attorney Thomas Miller stepped between Richard and Hannah, opening a thick leather briefcase on the mahogany entry table. Mr. Vance, Miller stated with absolute freezing clarity, this real estate, along with its associated operating trust, was purchased entirely with private funds belonging to the late Arthur Vance and deeded irrevocably to his granddaughter upon her 22nd birthday. Every deed, tax record, and corporate filing has been vetted by 3 independent accounting firms and filed with the state Supreme Court Registry, meaning your accusations of fraud are entirely groundless and defamatory. Richard stared down at the crisp legal documents stamped with official state seals, his mouth opening and closing as his grand narrative of authority and superiority disintegrated in front of him. Realizing that he had no legal leverage to claim a single dollar of the estate, he turned on his heel to walk out the front doors with a bitter sneer on his lips. But just as he reached the threshold of the glass entry, his gaze drifted upward to the stone wall above the main staircase, where a large oil painting hung illuminated by gallery lights. It was a life-sized portrait of Evelyn painted during her final year of college, showing her standing in a sunlit garden with a bright, radiant smile that captured her warmth and kindness. Richard froze completely in mid-stride, the color draining instantly from his face until his skin turned the shade of ash beneath the California sunshine. His chest heaved with a sudden, ragged breath, his fingers twitched at his sides, and he whispered a single word that carried more terror than anger, no. Why did the sight of his late wife's college portrait transform Richard's self-righteous fury into pure, paralyzing dread within the span of 3 heartbeats? That afternoon, once Richard had retreated down the driveway, Thomas Miller guided Hannah into the estate's private library and unlocked a heavy steel document vault built directly into the cedar wall. Inside the safe were 24 binders organized with meticulous labels, containing financial traces, tax returns, and corporate filings that grandfather Arthur had gathered during the final decade of his life. The attorney opened the master ledger and pointed to a series of foundational corporate filings dated 3 decades ago for a regional company known as Pacific Medical Logistics. Hannah leaned over the table, scanning the faded signatures on the incorporation papers, and felt the room spin as she realized her mother, Evelyn, had been the primary 40% shareholder of the firm. Evelyn had not simply been a modest homemaker with a small personal savings account, she was the co-founder of a logistics enterprise that generated over $8 million in net annual revenue before her death. Yet when Hannah turned the pages of the ledger to the months immediately following Evelyn's funeral, the mystery deepened into a disturbing financial labyrinth that defies basic logic. 3 months after Evelyn was buried, a series of stock transfer certificates were filed with the State Corporate Commission, shifting every single one of Evelyn's 40,000 shares directly into Richard's personal holdings. The transfer documents claimed to have been signed by Evelyn 2 days before she entered the ICU, yet the handwriting on the signature line showed a rigid, unnatural stroke that looked entirely unlike her fluid, graceful script. Richard had forged his dying wife's signature while she lay under sedation in the hospital, stripping her estate of its primary asset so he could pledge the corporate shares as collateral for his own speculative real estate ventures. But as Thomas Miller pointed out by tapping a finger against the notary stamp at the bottom of the page, a husband cannot bypass corporate probate court with a forged signature alone. Someone with deep knowledge of the state legal code and access to official seals had assisted Richard in executing the fraudulent transfer behind the family's back. Who could have betrayed Evelyn's memory to help Richard steal her inheritance? To uncover the identity of the accomplice who aided Richard in his financial deception, Arthur Vance had spent his golden years conducting a relentless private investigation outside the family's awareness. Over the course of 7 years, the quiet grandfather had scheduled discreet meetings in quiet diners and hotel lobbies with people who had known the family during the years Evelyn was alive. Among the sworn affidavits inside the library safe was an interview with Mr. Henderson, the retired commercial banker who had handled the initial corporate loan applications for Richard's early business developments. Mr. Henderson testified on tape that he had explicitly warned Richard in the months before Evelyn's illness that his commercial real estate loans were underwater and facing imminent default without a massive capital injection. Another detailed deposition came from David Ross, the former family accountant who had resigned in protest 6 months after Evelyn's death because he noticed glaring discrepancies in the dividend distribution reports. Every single witness Arthur had interviewed reiterated the exact same sentiment to the old man: "We always knew something sinister was brewing with the way Richard handled the estate, but we lacked the forensic proof to stop him." Yet when Thomas Miller and Hannah reviewed the master index of Arthur's investigative files on Thursday morning, they discovered a glaring irregularity that threatened to halt their quest for the truth. According to Arthur's handwritten table of contents, Section 14 was supposed to contain a thick file labeled the notary ledger, the exact document identifying the corrupt official who stamped Richard's forged transfer papers. But when Hannah pulled folder 14 from the steel shelf inside the library vault, the heavy manila envelope was completely empty, with its clasp broken and the inner pages missing. Thomas Miller checked the chain of custody logs kept by the legal firm over the past 4 years and confirmed that the lawyers had never removed Section 14 from the secured estate inventory. Someone had gained access to Arthur's private study during the final chaotic weeks of the old man's life, right before he passed away, and systematically removed the single document that proved corporate conspiracy. Could Richard have suspected his father's private investigation and raided the study during the funeral preparations, or did another unseen individual take the ledger for reasons of their own? That Friday afternoon, driven by the desperate need to solve the missing puzzle piece before her father could launch another legal offensive, Hannah drove into downtown Los Angeles to visit a private secure storage facility. Grandfather Arthur had maintained a climate-controlled locker under an alias for over 15 years, paying the monthly rental fees through an anonymous cashier's check drawn from a private county bank account. When Hannah arrived at the heavy steel roll-up door of Unit 408 and punched in the 6-digit access code her grandfather had written on the back of his first letter, the lock clicked open with a metallic snap. Standing inside the dimly lit storage unit, waiting patiently on a folding steel chair beside a stack of old family photo albums, was an elderly woman wearing a tailored blue coat and silver jewelry. Hannah recognized her immediately as Margaret Hayes, her mother's former college roommate and closest confidant, whom Richard had forbidden from visiting the house within weeks of Evelyn's passing. Margaret stepped forward with tears glistening in her eyes, embraced Hannah warmly, and handed her a small cedar box locked with a heavy brass padlock. "Your grandfather left this in my personal custody 4 years ago," Margaret explained gently, "and he gave me strict instructions to hand it to you only after you were safely residing inside the Malibu house." Inside the cedar box, cushioned by layers of velvet fabric, lay Evelyn Vance's personal leather-bound journal, its pages softened by years of use and filled with her neat, flowing handwriting. Taped to the front cover of the journal was a final yellow sticky note written in Grandfather Arthur's distinctive script, bearing 3 simple words underlined twice in black ink: "Read this last." Hannah sat on the floor of the Los Angeles storage unit right next to Margaret, turned on the overhead bulb, and carefully opened the journal to the entries dated during the final 6 months of her mother's life. As she read through the pages, the terrible reality of what her mother had endured during her final months on Earth unfolded with heartbreaking clarity and undeniable precision. Evelyn had discovered Richard's massive financial debts and his secret consultations with shady mortgage brokers 3 months before she began experiencing the first physical symptoms of her illness. She knew with absolute certainty that her husband was facing financial ruin due to his own greed, and she realized he was looking at her corporate logistics shares as his only potential lifeline. The final journal entry, written just 5 days before Evelyn was admitted to the hospital for the last time, revealed the conversation that had taken place when Arthur visited her bed. Evelyn wrote that she had uncovered the forged transfer documents Richard had already drafted and hidden inside his desk drawer, waiting for the moment she was too weak to protest. Because she knew her physical strength was failing and that Richard would use his legal authority as her husband to control probate, she turned to the only person she could trust on earth, her father-in-law, Arthur. She begged Arthur not to confront Richard immediately in court, knowing that a lengthy, bitter legal battle would drag 10-year-old Hannah through years of emotional trauma and public scandal. Instead, she asked Arthur to let the shares go quietly to satisfy Richard's immediate greed, while Arthur secretly took her share of the remaining corporate dividends to build an untouchable sanctuary for Hannah in the future. "Protect my daughter from him," Evelyn had written on the final page, her handwriting shaky and blurred by dried teardrops. "He will try to erase every memory of me from that house, and when he realizes he cannot control her spirit, he will try to erase her too." As Hannah sat in the storage unit holding her mother's journal against her chest, the deepest, most agonizing question of her entire life suddenly answered itself with devastating clarity. For 12 years, she had tortured herself wondering what she had done wrong as a child to cause her father's warmth to turn into ice the moment her mother died. Now she understood the truth behind every ignored birthday, every cold glance across the dinner table, and the ultimate cruelty of being thrown out onto the lawn on a freezing October night. It wasn't because Hannah was difficult, or because she had failed to meet his expectations, or because she was unlovable as a daughter. It was because as Hannah grew from a 10-year-old girl into a young woman of 22, her facial structure, her voice, her mannerisms, and her gentle spirit became the living mirror of her mother, Evelyn. Every single time Richard looked into his daughter's eyes across the breakfast table, he didn't see a child to nurture, he saw the exact reflection of the woman whose signature he had forged and whose legacy he had stolen. He threw Hannah out of his house because her very existence was a daily, inescapable indictment of his guilt, a living monument to the crime he had committed 20 years ago. Can you imagine the heavy weight of realizing that your own father hated you simply because you reminded him of the woman he wronged? On Monday morning, rather than filing a public lawsuit or seeking dramatic revenge in the county courthouse, Hannah asked attorney Thomas Miller to deliver one final item to Richard's downtown real estate office. It was a simple white envelope containing a single sheet of heavy stationery written by grandfather Arthur exactly 1 week before the old man passed away peacefully in his sleep. The attorney arrived at Richard's private office suite, bypassed the receptionist with professional persistence, and placed the sealed letter directly onto the center of Richard's mahogany desk before walking out without saying a word. Richard sat alone in his quiet office, his hands shaking slightly as he picked up the envelope, recognized his father's handwriting, and sliced it open with a silver letter opener. He unfolded the thick paper and read the words that Arthur had carefully drafted to serve as the final chapter of their strained father-son relationship across 2 tumultuous decades. You spent your life chasing my wealth, Arthur wrote with profound, sorrowful clarity. You never realized, my greatest treasure, was my granddaughter. Richard stared down at the handwritten page for a long, suffocating moment as the traffic of downtown Los Angeles buzzed faintly through the double-paned window of his office. He did not pick up the telephone to call his defense attorneys, he did not slam his fist against the mahogany desk in a fit of rage, and he did not utter a single word of defiance. Instead, his fingers went completely limp, allowing the heavy sheet of linen paper to flutter gently out of his grasp and land face up on the polished wood surface. He slumped backward into his leather desk chair, closed his eyes, and let out a long, shuddering breath as the full realization of what he had destroyed washed over him like a freezing tide. He had spent 20 years manipulating documents, alienating his family, and sacrificing his relationship with his only child just to acquire status and wealth that slipped through his fingers anyway. By trying to bury his wife's memory and cast away his daughter, he had locked himself inside a prison of his own construction, stripped of family, honor, and love for the rest of his days. 6 months later, on a bright spring afternoon where the coastal wildflowers were blooming in vibrant shades of orange and purple along the Malibu cliffs, the estate looked entirely different. The $30 million property was no longer a silent, fortress-like trap waiting to spring on a greedy father, it had been transformed into a vibrant, living home filled with purpose and warmth. Utilizing 50% of the recovered dividend funds from Evelyn's original logistics shares, Hannah and attorney Thomas Miller formally established the Arthur and Evelyn Vance Educational Foundation within the estate's main conference wing. Every year, the foundation provides comprehensive 4-year university scholarships, housing assistance, and emotional counseling to 30 young women across the state who have been disowned, abandoned, or displaced by their families. As Hannah walked across the sunlit limestone terrace overlooking the crashing waves of the Pacific, watching 5 of the new scholarship recipients laughing and studying around the outdoor table, she felt a profound quietness settle over her soul. She realized that grandfather Arthur had not simply purchased a mansion to mock her father, he had provided her with the exact physical and financial foundation needed to heal her broken past and build a legacy of compassion. Standing at the edge of the bluff with the sea breeze lifting her hair, Hannah smiled quietly as her grandfather's ultimate lesson echoed clearly inside her heart, the greatest inheritance wasn't $30 million. It wasn't the mansion. It wasn't even the truth. It was finally realizing. I was never the burden. I was simply surrounded by people who never deserved me. What would you have done if you were in her position? Would you have forgiven your father, or walked away forever? Tell us in the comments. We read every single one. If this story moved you, hit the like button and share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you think this ending was unbelievable, wait until you see our next story, it might change the way you see family forever.